So Invincible Season 3 wrapped up about a week ago at the time I'm recording this, and just like the first two seasons, I absolutely loved it. What I was thinking about doing for this video before I watched Season 3 was doing basically the same thing I did for my Invincible Season 2 video, where I talked about my favorite characters and what their arcs and internal conflict was for the season and how it got explored. And I could talk about things like Mark getting his ass whooped and being like,
let me tell you something, let me tell you something. Alright. Let me tell you something, let me tell you something.
Meanwhile, Conquest is more like, but this season wound up doing something that still relates to pretty much all the characters in the show and, you know, what I just mentioned, that I really liked. And that's how it touches on the nuance of what it means to be a superhero, or just like, you know, a good person, or just the nuance of morality in general. What you should do versus what you have to do sometimes for the betterment of yourself or other people, as well as the situations people are put in that either shape them into who they are or the actions they take. And I'll still talk about Conquest at the end of this video because, you know, how could I not? So let me first start by talking about this moment between Cecile and Mark after Mark finds out that Cecile has been using fake Batman sidekick and fake Professor Pig to aid in defending the world. They have an argument about this, and Mark comes into this from the perspective that these people are irredeemable monsters and they should basically suffer in prison with no hope for change or improvement, or to be able to repay their mistakes because of what they did. And Cecile comes at it from the exact opposite perspective because he knows that people can change, and he knows that in order to keep the Earth safe, he has to use each and every resource, contingency, and opportunity he has to do that job. And we know this is nothing new for Cecile. It's been a part of his character for the past, 2 seasons now. And it only gets more amplified the more these threats continue to pop up and, the more threatening these threats become. Even though, we all believe that Cecile cares for Mark, Cecile is still scared of Mark, and he's still very cautious of the potential damage that Mark could cause to the world if, he turned out like his dad. And one of my favorite things about the conflict between Mark and Cecile this season is the flashbacks to Cecile when he was a young government agent. It shows us that Cecile was just like Mark when he was younger. He would fight battles and try to do the best he can, even if it's, a personal sacrifice to himself, or if he's outmatched. And we see both of those things in this sequence. And Cecile was also naive to the greater good. I mean, he even keeps a scar on his face to, remember what happened and to make sure it never happens again. It's kind of similar to Mark in season 2, how he's so set in stone and like he can never have something like this happen again. And, that continues into season 3 with Mark's character as well. But eventually, Cecile got older and he eventually started to adopt and understand his mentor figure's mindset, because it really is the only kind of mindset that you can have in order to do like Cecile's job as effectively as possible. The best element of this part of the show for me is that while Mark is not unreasonable for thinking what he thinks about this, or anyone else for that matter, he's also not right in this situation, and Cecile makes a good point when calling Mark a hypocrite for not keeping the same standard for his dad, or even Oliver for that matter, as we come to see later in the show, or when he asks Mark if he should be in prison for killing Angstrom. Mark argues that killing Angstrom was different, but while Angstrom did terrible things, Mark still killed someone he didn't have to kill. And it's one of those elements of the show that I like so much, just how human the show is with our flaws and strengths. Mark would obviously be more willing to forgive and be more sympathetic towards someone he cares about or has, loved or is known for a while, just like a lot of us would. Whether it be, him consciously knowing this or unconsciously knowing this. If your family member or close friend does something really bad in your eyes, it's hard to not want to give them the chance to improve or be more open to understanding things from their perspective. And there's a line in this show during Rex's funeral where Eve says, when you know someone for so long, it's hard to not think of them as that same person that you've known for so long, even if they are changing. But obviously, if someone you don't know does that very same bad thing, most people more times than not are more likely to just brush them off as a terrible person for the rest of their life and not give, some random person the same kind of sympathy or understanding as someone they're close with. But I mean, they both do make mistakes here. Cecile didn't have to immediately resort to bringing Mark into the White Room and putting the Dolatrons on him, and he also didn't need to keep putting Mark through immense pain with the sound frequency thing. He did those things out of fear, and I think they both handle their differences really badly because of that same fear. Mark doesn't want people like Sinclair or Darkwing to have the chance to hurt people again, and Cecile doesn't want threats like Omni-Man or other Viltrumites to just continue running through the planet while they can't do anything about it. And like Cecile says, he doesn't want to waste the talent that they have when they can change and they can be reformed. informed. But ultimately, I think Cecile's right here, like absolutely. If you want to handle things as effectively and efficiently as possible, you can't always say or do the thing that's, considered nice or considered the most morally good thing sometimes. Sometimes you just have to be real and look at things from the most logical perspective, otherwise you will never be able to get to the meat of what something actually is. And this can go for most, if not all things. Like for an extreme example I can use in real life. If someone was a pedo, for example, most people would immediately resort to calling them a terrible individual who did a really bad thing because, they did. But while you can go the rest of your life thinking that person is, terrible, unlikable, irredeemable, or any word you want to use to describe them or what they did, the fact of the matter is anyone can change and be better than what they were before. Anyone can be unforgivable to people, but almost nobody is unchangeable. And I'm going to mention this again later in the video when I talk about Conquest. But Mark throughout the season continues to have things that, challenge his morals. This is just the first of one of those moral dilemmas this season. And the next things that I'm going to bring up in this video are pretty much all going to stem off of this. Now I'm going to talk about the couple that we see with powers and they rob this bank or try to. And when we first see them try to do this, they luckily get off scot-free and they decide to not risk ruining their lives again or traumatizing any more people. We see them struggle through life, barely eating, working a low-paid job, and barely being able to afford the bad apartment they have, just trying to make an honest living, doing things, by the book or the good way. But eventually they get fired from their job and they become homeless, which causes them to use their powers again to rob a bank. And you can just tell they don't want to be doing this, but it's something that they feel like they have to, only for Mark and Oliver to come in and just beat their ass badly. And I just love this sequence in the show, not just because it humanizes and helps us understand why people can do the things they do, but also because it plays off really well in how naive Mark can be to the bad guys he fights. Are these guys in the right for robbing this bank? No. Could they have used their powers and potentially made money a different way? Maybe. But sometimes life brings people to a point where they feel like they have to do the things they think would work best to stop what they're going through. And another instance that stretches to Mark is when the people from episode 1 who try to steal the Declaration of Independence, they come to him for help from the future. Now, there's something I want to talk about with this that I could potentially see someone criticizing the show for. Hell, I almost fell into that until I just stopped watching the show for like an hour and just let myself really sit with the episodes that I just watched previously. And a similar thing happened to me in season 2, and I'll just play a clip from that video to, show what I'm talking about. But after this, Mark meets Nawalzad, and he asks to help his planet from the meteor showers. Mark says that he can't because of missing classes, but I think it's really because he feels obligated to stay on Earth because of what happened with his dad, and like he said to his mom in episode 2, the last time he did something on his own, half a city got destroyed. And him leaving is him continuing to grow past those fears, and I like the dialogue where he tells Cecile that he feels responsible for all the deaths that happened, and then he has a new chance to save billions of lives, and Mark takes the advice from his mom about listening to himself before listening to Cecile, and her other advice about figuring out who he wants to be moving forward, and Cecile tells him that his father was the same way, as a way to try and manipulate Mark, and Mark just thinks for a second as he flies away and he continues going on. Now that I've played that clip, I want to get into Mark seemingly acting out of character here, but I don't think it's out of character in the sense of it being bad writing, but let me explain. Now, in previous seasons, we know that Mark has been really empathetic towards people. I mean, like Titan, for example, showed Mark in season 1 to not look at the world so black and white. But here in season 3, even from the first episode, we see Mark acting pretty differently and being more thick-headed in his worldview. Obviously, season 3 is riding off of Mark's arc of him, focusing almost completely on his abilities in superhero life so that he can trust himself to control himself and so that he can be sure to not end up like his father. But at the beginning of season 3, we see Mark start to have a lot on his plate once again. He has to still be a superhero. He starts dating Adam Eve because he feels like he owes it to her. But obviously, he also has liked her since season 1, and as the show progresses, she is someone that Mark needs and appreciates in his life that will help him get through emotional turmoil. But Mark is now also dealing with the fact that he has to be a mentor and, basically like a father figure for Oliver. Mark has a lot on his plate, and he kind of starts off this season with a really no bullshit attitude, which is where I think this loss of the previous empathy that he once had stems from. And I think the way he's trying to continue not turning out like his dad is by sticking to his moral compass that he's, believes in strongly and not really accepting outside opinions, which is again another reason why, like I said earlier, Cecile's almost completely in the right and justified about the things relating to his conflict with Mark, because Mark is currently sharing traits of, Viltrumites, traits that his father once possessed, with not being open to things going against what he believes in. It's just a nice bit of irony that the show uses, and this relates back to this little side quest that Mark goes on in the future, because he denies helping them for a couple reasons. One, because he sees them as criminals and doesn't want to deal with with or work with them, and 2, because he doesn't really think he can trust them. But obviously, once they basically force him to help, Mark sees that they weren't lying, and he also sees the state of the future, and he winds up helping because, Mark is just inherently a good person. He's going to help if he sees something like this. And here he gets hit with another moral dilemma that once again proves Cecile right. Mark kills Immortal, and he's obviously not happy about it, but he had to do it in order to save the world from what Immortal was doing to the world. In this moment, Mark may have not been the good guy, but he was the guy that just saved the world. And it's not just killing Immortal that's weighing on Mark, but also what he sees himself become in the future. And directly after this, we get a perfect moment where he goes to Eve and tells her what happens, and her saying that she will always be there to keep Mark in check as long as he does the same for her is just such a perfect ending to this whole sequence, where Mark starts to question the worldview that he keeps being so stubborn about. And it's not just with this scenario, but also with things like Debbie and Mark having to explain to Oliver why he can't kill. And while it's not exactly Mark's moral dilemma at this point, them explaining to Oliver why he shouldn't kill, this inadvertently proves Cecile right once again, because Mark explaining that, people like have other things outside of like, what the conflict that he might be dealing with or Oliver might be dealing with in regards to them. There's other things outside that you have to consider, which is why you shouldn't kill, which goes in favor of Cecile's argument that people can be reformed. And while Cecile obviously does kill people himself, and he's fine with killing because he knows that you have to do that sometimes, that right there just shows the amount of like nuance with this shit. Like the fact that Cecile knows that people can be redeemed, but also knows that you have to kill certain people at points, even if they could potentially be redeemed. It just goes to show that I obviously still think Cecile is mostly right in this like situation or this whole dilemma, but it just goes to show that nobody is completely right when arguing about this kind of thing. And it doesn't just stop with that. Another instance of this moral dilemma we run into is when Rockman goes to Mark for help. Titan explains to Mark that if he doesn't help get Multipole out of prison, then someone else is going to be in charge of the community that Titan worked so hard to turn around and make a better place, and turn it back to the way that it was before. And Mark is hit with the dilemma. Should he help break out the assassin from prison, who will ultimately kill a bunch of people, or does he let Titan deal with his own problems, which could result in him dying and a whole community becoming worse for it? It somewhat relates back to the whole do you kill one man to save 1,000 theme that connects to Mark's character arc in the show, and just the moral dilemma of killing in general. And the decision Mark makes out of this almost completely blows up in his face, as numerous other people get killed for this, and Multipole winds up getting away anyway. And it's not like we can blame Mark completely for his choice. He chose not to let an assassin out of prison who could kill a bunch of people, but had he listened to Titan, those people wouldn't have died at that prison. Hell, Mark almost dies at that prison. And we continue to see Mark's actions blow up in his face, with Powerplex, or Jesse Pinkman to be specific. Invincible, yo! Come out and fight, yo! No, Mr. White! I don't want to fight Stretchy Guy, yo! I want Invincible, yo! I'm sorry. But seriously, I love Powerplex in this season. I think he was probably my favorite antagonist for the season, and one of my favorites throughout the whole show in general. I mean, we see this guy who just lost his sister and niece in the blink of an eye, and all he wants is to get some answers, and for Invincible to get some consequences for his actions. We see him grow more and more mentally unstable, as he basically has no shot of giving Invincible consequences the way he originally wanted to, and I think the thing I like most about this is the fact that he's not entirely wrong. I mean, whenever Mark or any of these superheroes fight, a lot of the times, a lot of collateral damage is caused. Sometimes it's not avoidable, but sometimes, and probably the biggest example I can use, sometimes we run into fights like Conquest, where Mark could have definitely avoided some of the damage to the cities that he fought through. Like, he didn't need to crash Conquest through multiple buildings in this fight. Like, he literally levels, like, I don't know, like 6 skyscrapers. He probably could have just ran to a less populated area and Conquest would have followed him earlier in the fight. But Mark is impulsive and very prone to emotional outbursts. And another flaw with Mark's character that I realized, especially during the Conquest fight, it's made pretty clear, as well as during the Invincible War, it takes someone Mark cares about or knows personally for him to get more level-headed during these moments. I'm not saying that he doesn't care for, random innocent civilians, but like when Eve or Oliver try to help him, the first thing on his mind is keeping them safe. Whereas when he first started fighting Conquest, he's crashing him through buildings, forgetting about if other people could be in those buildings and they could, be dying, or even around the buildings when, the rubble falls. Mark being kind of careless is something that he's done since, one of his very first fights in season 1, and it's still never been something that he's entirely grew from. And his impulsive nature and, him being prone to emotional outbursts is one of the things that led him to snapping on Angstrom Levy in season 2 when he killed him. And another example, when Eve is badly injured in the hospital, Mark can't even bring himself to leave her side. And at points, it's not like Mark wants to intentionally cause so much collateral damage, but he lets his emotions get the best of him, and he also holds back at points, which causes things to get worse than they needed to be originally, if he was to, not hold back. So it's not like Powerplex doesn't have a bit of a point, and even Mark acknowledges that he has a point. But Powerplex doesn't see it from Mark's perspective like we do. Like, we know how hard Mark tries to keep people safe. We know he has the world's best interests at heart. We know that Mark isn't always responsible for the bad things that happen, and we know that Mark is still only a young adult and with, more maturing to do, and for him to make more mistakes to learn from. And in Powerplex's anger and in trying to get revenge for what Mark was involved in, he winds up inadvertently and unconsciously proving that his revenge arc isn't really justified. He puts himself in a position where, from his perspective, he's doing the right thing. But in doing so, he winds up hitting Mr. Foreskin-tastic so hard that the crowd thinks that he killed him. And in this moment, Powerplex becomes the very thing that he hates. He gets put in the shoes that he was putting Mark in. Powerplex didn't want this to happen, but it did. And those people from the outside who are, scared of him and looking at him like he's a monster also don't have the context to be able to accurately judge Powerplex at this moment. This whole perspective thing is also another element of the show that I like. I'm not gonna get too much into it, but like with Paul, for example, Debbie's boyfriend, him trying to like relate to Mark and Oliver and like try and, compare his situations that he deals with to like this kind of stuff that Mark and Oliver deal with as he like gets self-conscious about it. It's a big thing about perspective, and like the perspective here with Powerplex that he doesn't really grasp to the full extent that he could is the fact that like when people like superheroes make mistakes, those can be a lot more impactful than, mistakes that like regular people make. And he winds up getting so blindsided by emotion that he kills his own wife and child. And it kind of parallels how Mark is trying to right the wrongs of and not become like his father, but in doing what he thinks is the right thing, he starts becoming the very thing that he doesn't want to be. Like, this part of the show is just so well done in my opinion, and I loved Powerplex's character. He was definitely one of the best antagonists in this whole show. But now we can finally talk about Conquest, and goddamn was he good. But right before Conquest shows up, Mark has to finally start reconciling with how he's been acting this whole season. And I would say that this is the start of where we see how Mark starts to internally see things from Cecile's perspective, even if it's slightly unconscious for him, and how his loved ones can, warp his perspective and decision making at points, as he talks to Eve, acknowledging that he played a part in probably the worst thing that has ever happened to the world, that his moral beliefs and way of thinking is what can cause something just like this to happen again, just because he hesitated to kill Engstrom. And when talking to Eve's mom, she tells him that someone who knew Eve died during the attacks, and Mark just sits there and internally knows that he could also be responsible for not stopping that, because while he was in the hospital watching over Eve, hundreds of thousands of people were dying. And I love this moment where Cecile is trying to touch base with all the heroes on board right now, and he offers Mark to become the leader of the Guardians. And Mark says that he's not qualified, and that's because he doesn't know if he's ready to make the kind of decisions that need to be made. Again, this is something that I think Mark is kind of realizing that, Cecile's right earlier. And Cecile tries to reassure him by saying that Mark stood up to him, and that means something, because Cecile also acknowledges that maybe he can do the wrong thing at points too. Then he drops some bars on Mark.
But we're still on the same side. We're still trying to save lives, and we're still the good guys.
Yeah, I got an album.
Do you? How many?
But I'm not a rapper.
And tells them that if he needs someone to talk to, he's there. And Mark says that he doesn't want to talk to him at all right now, but ultimately thanks Cecile, which again, I think is just because he's starting to understand why Cecile does certain things, even if he doesn't agree. And after all the emotional turmoil that's just been building up in Mark, after the shit with Powerplex and after the Invincible War, after all that anger and questioning of his morality that not only Mark has been questioning, but also the show has been questioning and showing nuance to this entire season, it all culminates into someone who is just completely irredeemable. Someone who might as well not even be a person, but more like a demon that Mark has to face. And for us, this couldn't come at a better moment. But for Mark, this is probably the worst moment. Now, earlier in the video, I said that almost nobody is unable to change. But what I really mean is that anyone can change, but those who can't are simply those who won't. And I mean, Conquest knows this. He tells Mark that he's so lonely that he could cry at points, but nobody would even care, so he doesn't. That the more he's successful at what he does, the more he's feared. And that he wasn't even given a name, he was simply given a purpose. And obviously, Conquest is just entertaining on his own with how sadistic and fucking ruthless he is. And just the dialogue with his character and the voice acting is just so good. But I really think the line of him saying he's so lonely and explaining everything else just not only adds a nice layer to his character that makes him more interesting than just, you know, evil dude, but it also perfectly wraps up the theme of morality this season that it's been so heavy in pushing. Conquest saying that he's so lonely he could cry, but he doesn't because no one would care. And he tells Mark that, you know, the kind of attachment that he has for someone like Eve is a weakness and that there's nothing like that on Viltrum. It really just goes to show how even though he grew up with this kind of mindset basically programmed into his brain, that he can understand Mark. And if he can understand Mark, then that means he can inherently change. But he doesn't change because he doesn't even think it would matter. He's feared by everyone he knows, and it's actually just sad, even him being this monster by choice, who says he enjoys what he does. The show still makes it so that you can sympathize and or understand how someone like him became the way he is. And I don't even believe him when he says that he enjoys this. Otherwise, why would he say that he's capable of so much more? I think he's kind of similar to Nolan in the sense that, you know, Nolan has accepted his fate for what he's done, you know, like when he's ready to accept his death. Only in Conquest's case, he's accepted the notion that he wasn't even given a name, he was given a purpose. This is who he is. He's just such a brilliant character to bring into this finale, and it's not just for him being a good character, but also for how it wraps up Mark's story. During this fight, you can tell that Mark is obviously trying extremely hard to beat someone that he just can't. And while he says in the beginning of their fight that all he wants to do is hit something as hard as possible, I do think for a lot of this fight, Mark is still holding back. Not in the sense that he's not, you know, hitting Conquest as hard as he possibly can, but more so in the sense that Mark is not fighting to kill. He's not giving it literally his all. I think he's still trying to hold on to the last bit of that part of his humanity until Adam Eve dies. And after that happens, you can see that Mark is just now giving everything he possibly has left in his body to just kill him. And obviously, he couldn't have done that without help. Like, if Adam Eve never came back to life, I don't think Mark lives here. He would probably have died. But that's besides the point. And after this, Mark isn't regretful that he kills him. It's a nice juxtaposition to the end of season 2, where after killing Engstrom, he couldn't even look at the body anymore and he had to like completely walk away. Whereas now, he's making sure that Conquest is dead, demanding to see the body, and then telling Oliver that if anyone ever puts someone he loves at risk again, he will not hesitate to kill them. And I like this line for multiple reasons other than, you know, concluding Mark's character arc this season. One, it just really compounds on how much Mark's loved ones affect his decision making and like, you know, just him as a person. And two, the other reason this hits so hard is because during the Invincible War, Eve being in the hospital stopped him from doing what he needed to do. It's not like he couldn't, it's that he wouldn't, because mentally he couldn't just leave Eve there in the hospital knowing she could die, or if someone could, you know, go there and attack them. Hell, him not trying to kill the other Marks in episode 7 is probably the reason Eve was in the hospital to begin with. And it's really going to be interesting going forward in this show, just how this new mindset is going to change the way Mark goes about things. Now, as far as problems I had with this season, I can't really think much of anything. Outside of the fact that it didn't make much sense to me why Adam Eve couldn't just destroy Conquest's metal hand unless his hand is sentient matter somehow. I don't know. That's really all I can think of, and it's not much of a big deal. Maybe I could find some things if I rewatch the whole season again, but I don't feel like doing that. Honestly, this is probably tied with season 2 for me as my favorite season of the show. There's obviously more about the season that I could talk about and stuff that I love, but this was just the stuff that I wanted to talk about the most. And one more thing I want to point out was just how good the voice acting was this season. I mean, goddamn, especially Steven Yeun, who plays Mark. His acting in this season was just fucking top notch. Probably his best performance of any of the seasons. So yeah, I just had to mention that. But anyways, I give this season a strong 9.5 out of 10. Let me know what you guys think about it in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it if you became a channel member for as little as $1 a month to get most of my videos early. I thank you all for watching, and yeah.